Hey, I'm Colton. Yeah, just plain old Colton. I'm 26. I live in a small, quiet town in Oregon. And for the past 2 years, I've been working remote as a graphic designer. Not glamorous, but it pays the bills and, most importantly, it lets me dream. And for as long as I can remember, my dream has been the same, to take off in a camper van and see America. As a kid back in Ukraine, I used to draw little sketches of my future house on wheels. I'd tape maps to my bedroom wall, circle cities I wanted to visit, and imagine myself just driving, stopping wherever I wanted, meeting people, living free. It sounds crazy now, but that childhood obsession stuck with me. And a few months ago, I found her a beat-up Dodge B350 van, dusty, rusty, and perfect. I spent weeks rebuilding it, transforming the inside with a small bed, storage, a camping stove, even a tiny solar panel setup. My friends thought I was out of my mind. I didn't care. I called her the Voyager. So now it's finally happening. This morning I woke up knowing, this is it. I'm leaving. I spent hours packing the last of my things. Clothes, my camera, an old coffee mug I can't live without, books I'll probably never read, but feel better carrying anyway. As I was strapping the last bungee cord to my bike rack, I heard a voice behind me. Going somewhere. It was Maris, my neighbor. She's about 42, but you'd never guess it. Tall, striking, soft waves of dark hair always perfectly framing her face. I've seen her coming and going, sometimes watering the flowers in her front yard, sometimes just standing on her porch with a glass of wine, staring at the sky. We never talked much, just a casual hi and bye. I knew she had recently gone through a divorce. I also knew she lived alone now. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and smiled. Yeah, actually, I'm about to finally do it. I'm taking off to travel the country. Her eyes lit up. In that, she laughed, motioning to my old van. Yep, I chuckled. She's not pretty, but she's ready. Maris walked over, curious. Wow, that's pretty incredible. Not many people actually chase their dreams. I shrugged. Took me long enough. Then, completely without thinking, I joked. If you were my age, I'd invite you along. She tilted her head, gave me this knowing half-smile, and said, What are we waiting for? I froze. It was like time stopped. I stared at her, trying to figure out if she was serious or just teasing me. Wait, what? I stammered. Maris laughed again. I mean it. I've got nothing keeping me here. I haven't done anything spontaneous in years. If you'll have me, I'm in. I rubbed the back of my neck, completely caught off guard. I had never imagined someone like her, my gorgeous, elegant, older neighbor, actually wanting to jump into a van with me and drive off into the unknown. Are you serious? I asked, probably for the third time. She nodded firmly. I'm dead serious. I smiled nervously. Well, go pack then. Maris gave me a quick wink and hurried back to her house. I stood there stunned, watching her disappear into her doorway. Was this really happening? Was this quiet woman who had always seemed so distant actually going to join me? About 30 minutes later, she emerged with a small, neat suitcase, wearing comfortable jeans, sneakers, and a leather jacket. Her eyes sparkled as she walked up. I'm ready, she said confidently. I didn't say a word. I just opened the passenger door, and she climbed in without hesitation. I slid behind the wheel, heart racing, completely unsure of what came next. But knowing this was the beginning of something unforgettable. As I turned the key and the engine rumbled to life, I glanced over at her. She smiled at me, then gazed out the window as we pulled onto the highway. The road stretched wide open in front of us. No plan, no reservations. Just two strangers with an old van, chasing the horizon. The first few miles felt surreal. I couldn't believe I was really doing this. I had dreamed of this moment for so long. Now here I was behind the wheel of the Voyager, heading out of town with Maris sitting beside me. She looked completely at ease, leaning back in the passenger seat with her legs casually crossed, sunglasses on, her wavy dark hair catching the sunlight as it blew slightly from the cracked window. I stole glances at her, still half wondering if this was real. The silence wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. We were both just taking it in. Finally, Maris spoke. So, where are we going first? She asked, her voice warm and curious. I grinned. I figured we'd start with the classics. Grand Canyon, Monument Valley, maybe Route 66. I've got a loose plan, but honestly, we're just going to follow the road. She nodded approvingly. I like that. The Oregon forests faded into wide, open highways. We drove through rolling hills, vast plains, tiny roadside towns. Maris seemed fascinated by everything. The vintage gas stations, the giant billboards, even the weird roadside attractions. Every hour or so, we stopped, sometimes to grab gas or coffee, sometimes just to stretch our legs and take silly photos next to random world's largest statues. We laughed more than I had in a long time. At nightfall on our first day, we pulled into a small, quiet campsite just outside Reno, Nevada. I parked the Voyager under a cluster of tall pines. "This is home for the night," I announced. I had expected her to be uncomfortable. I mean, the Voyager was charming in a rugged, homemade way, but it was still basically an old van with a mattress in the back and a curtain for privacy. To my surprise, Maris smiled warmly. "I love it." I gave her the bed and planned to crash in the front seat. The front wasn't exactly designed for sleeping, but I didn't want her to feel weird sharing the bed with me. I reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, bundled up in a thin blanket, and tried to get comfortable. I heard soft footsteps. Maris tapped lightly on the driver's window. "Are you seriously sleeping out here?" she whispered. I smiled sleepily. "Yeah, I want you to have a bed." She shook her head with a small laugh. "You're ridiculous, Colton. Good night." The next morning, I woke up stiff and sore, my neck aching from the awkward position. I stumbled out of the van, stretching, and found Maris already up, hair in a messy ponytail, wearing sweatpants and an oversized hoodie. She was brewing coffee over a small camping stove I had barely used before. "Morning, road warrior," she teased. I chuckled and rubbed my eyes. "You're full of surprises, Maris." We sat on fold-out chairs, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise. It was quiet, peaceful. I realized then that this wasn't just about ticking places off my bucket list. It was about these small, perfect moments. The days that followed were a blur of movement. The Voyager handled the roads better than I had expected. We traveled down winding desert highways and through small towns that looked frozen in time. Maris and I settled into an easy rhythm. I drove. She navigated, reading maps or pointing out funny signs along the road. At gas stations, she grabbed snacks while I topped off the tank. We'd sing loudly to classic rock on the radio, or would just sit in companionable silence. At night, we'd park at remote campsites or even the occasional Walmart parking lot when there was no other option. She always insisted on cooking, making simple meals like grilled cheese sandwiches or pasta with whatever ingredients we could find. There were no hotel rooms, no reservations, no real plan. It was freedom like I had never known. One evening as we drove through Arizona, the sun setting in fiery shades of orange and purple behind distant mesas, Maris leaned her head back against the seat and sighed. "I haven't felt this alive in years," she said quietly. I glanced over at her, the warm glow of the setting sun reflecting off her skin. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. We stopped later that night, near the edge of Monument Valley. The sky was so clear it looked like we could reach out and touch the stars. We laid out on a blanket next to the van and stared up in silence. "This is exactly how I imagined it," I whispered. Maris turned her head slightly toward me and smiled. "Same." That night, as I lay in the driver's seat again, I realized something had shifted. This wasn't just two neighbors on an adventure anymore. The connection between us was deepening in ways I hadn't expected. I fell asleep wondering what the next miles might bring. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of soft humming. My neck ached again from sleeping in the driver's seat, but I smiled when I realized it was Maris cooking breakfast outside the van. I stepped out, rubbing my shoulders. The cool morning air smelled like coffee and pine. "Morning, Colton," she greeted, flipping pancakes on a tiny camping griddle. "You seriously need to stop torturing yourself in that seat." I grinned sleepily. "It's fine. You're the guest." She raised an eyebrow. "Colton, we've been on the road for over a week. I think we've passed the whole guest stage." I laughed, but the truth was she was right. The awkwardness of the first days had completely disappeared. We had fallen into a rhythm. Two people from completely different worlds, somehow working as the perfect travel team. After breakfast, We packed up and hit the road. Our next stop was Yellowstone. The drive there was long but breathtaking. Endless fields, jagged mountain peaks, winding rivers that seemed to go on forever. We stopped constantly to take pictures. Maris had a surprisingly good eye for photography, and I admired her enthusiasm for every odd landmark or overlook. We spent hours in silence sometimes, comfortable just watching the road pass by. Other times we talked about everything: family, childhood, failed relationships, random dreams, music, food. The more she shared, the more I admired her. Maris wasn't just beautiful. She was smart, witty, and had this strength in her that I couldn't quite describe. By the time we rolled into Yellowstone, it was dark and cold. The temperature had dropped fast, and I could see Maris shiver as we stepped out to set up camp. "We can just sleep in the van tonight," I suggested. "I'm fine," she said, trying to sound tough as she pulled her coat tighter. We climbed into the Voyager and arranged the blankets. I immediately moved to the driver's seat, as I had every night. But this time Maris stopped me. "Colton," she said softly, "it's freezing out there. Please stop being so stubborn. Just share the bed with me. It's big enough, and we're adults." I hesitated. I knew she was right, but I didn't want to make her uncomfortable. She saw my hesitation and smiled gently. "I trust you." That simple sentence disarmed me. I nodded and crawled into the bed on the opposite side, keeping a respectful distance. The van was completely dark except for the faint light from the moon shining through the small window. We lay there silently for a while. I stared up at the tiny ceiling, trying not to think about how close she was. Eventually, I heard her whisper, "Thank you for letting me come with you." I didn't know how much I needed this. I turned my head toward her. "You're the best travel companion I could have asked for." The next morning, we woke up to the sound of birds and the golden sunlight pouring into the van. For the first time since we started, we didn't rush to pack up. We made breakfast and then wandered for hours through Yellowstone's geothermal fields, watched geysers erupt, and admired herds of bison crossing the roads like they owned the place. Later that day, we hiked to a remote lake. The water was so still it looked like glass. Without thinking, we both kicked off our shoes and waded into the icy water, shrieking and laughing at how cold it was. Afterward, we lay on a flat rock to dry off under the sun. I watched her close her eyes, her face calm and content. I realized then just how much things had changed. What started as two neighbors on an impulsive trip was turning into something much more complicated and much more beautiful. As we drove out of Yellowstone later that day, I caught her looking at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I smiled to myself and kept driving. That night, we stopped at a small campsite on the edge of a forest. As we sat outside under a sky full of stars, Maris moved closer. "I know this started as your dream," she said, "but it feels like mine too now." I looked at her, not sure what to say. The tension between us was soft but undeniable. The silence stretched until she rested her head lightly on my shoulder. We sat like that for a long time, just two people lost in the middle of nowhere, quietly realizing that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be just a road trip anymore. When we finally climbed back into the van for the night, we didn't even talk about who would take the bed. We both knew. As I lay beside her, inches apart, but feeling more connected than I had ever been to anyone, I whispered into the darkness, "I'm glad you came." Maris reached out, found my hand, and squeezed it gently. "Me too, Colton." Sleep came easily that night for both of us. We hit the road early the next morning, the van rumbling to life under a pale pink sky. There was something different now. Neither of us said it, but we both felt it. The walls we had built around ourselves had quietly fallen away. I glanced over at Maris as she flipped through an old paper map. "Big Sur?" I asked. She smiled without looking up. "Definitely Big Sur." We were driving along the jagged cliffs of the Pacific Coast Highway later that afternoon, the Voyager winding through sharp curves with the ocean stretching endlessly to our right. Waves crashed against rocks below. The salty air rushed in through the open windows, whipping Maris's dark hair wildly around her face. "You know," she laughed, "I haven't felt this free since I was a teenager sneaking out to see concerts in Portland." I laughed too, stealing a quick glance at her. "I've never felt this free. Ever." We stopped at almost every viewpoint. Maris insisted we take a photo at every stop, some serious, most ridiculous. Me pretending to push the van over a cliff, her standing triumphantly on a rock like a conqueror of the sea. At night, we camped near a secluded beach. We built a small fire with driftwood, ate peanut butter sandwiches, and stared out at the dark water shimmering under the moon. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was hypnotic. "I can't believe I almost didn't do this," she said quietly. I nudged her shoulder. "Me either." The next few weeks became a blur of adventure. We explored Bryce Canyon, walked the sandy curves of Antelope Canyon, hiked to hidden waterfalls, and drove through endless forests in Northern California. Maris brought the van to life in ways I hadn't expected. She was spontaneous where I was cautious. We'd pull off on the side of the road because she saw wildflowers or an old diner she wanted to check out. One afternoon in Colorado, we found ourselves parked beside an alpine lake with nobody around. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the snow-capped mountains like a mirror. "Let's swim," she said, already pulling off her shoes. "It's freezing." I laughed. She shrugged. "So, you only live once." I stood on the shore as she walked confidently into the ice-cold water. Her laughter echoed as she splashed around, daring me to join her. I shook my head, then gave in. The shock of the cold stole my breath, but the way she looked at me, eyes full of mischief and warmth, made me forget the temperature. We lay afterward on the warm rocks, drying off under the sun. There was no need for words. I watched the rise and fall of her chest, the way the sunlight danced across her skin. Later that evening, we found a tiny mountain town with a single diner and stopped for burgers and milkshakes. The older waitress called us the cute road trip couple. Maris laughed softly, and I felt my heart skip a beat. That night, parked at a remote lookout over the valley, we sat under a blanket, drinking bad gas station wine from paper cups. The conversation turned unexpectedly serious. "I needed this more than I realized," Maris confessed. "After the divorce, I forgot what it felt like to be excited about life." I looked over at her. "You've made this the best adventure of my life." She smiled softly. "You too, Colton." The moonlight made her features look almost unreal. Without thinking, I reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned her head on my shoulder. "I joked before. If you were my age, I'd take you with me," I said quietly. She chuckled and squeezed my hand gently. "The best part is, I'm my age and I still came." I turned and met her eyes. In that moment, every unspoken feeling between us became clear. I kissed her softly, and she kissed me back. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't reckless. It was natural, like everything else between us had been since the first mile. That night, as we lay side by side under the stars in the van, I knew something had changed forever. This wasn't just about the trip anymore. It was about us, about what we were becoming. I whispered, "I'm glad you said yes." Maris smiled and rested her head against my chest. "So am I." The hum of crickets, the cool mountain air, and her steady breathing beside me were the last things I remember before falling asleep. The road would still be waiting in the morning, but I no longer cared where it led. The trip home felt both fast and endless. As the Voyager ate up the miles, the excitement of discovery slowly shifted into a quiet comfort. We weren't racing anymore. We were just two people completely at peace with where we were. Maris leaned back in her seat, one leg tucked under her, watching the road. Her hair was tied loosely at the base of her neck, sunglasses hiding her eyes, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. We had driven nearly 7,000 miles. 2 months of mountains, deserts, beaches, diners, campfires, and more laughter than I had experienced in years. But the journey was winding down. As we crossed back into Oregon, I found myself thinking about what would happen next. The unspoken question had been hanging in the air the last few days. Will we go back to being just neighbors? Would this just be the memory of a perfect trip? The sun was setting as we rolled into our street. The Voyager creaked into its familiar parking spot. I shut off the engine. Silence. Maris stared ahead for a second, then turned to me. "Well, I guess we're home." "Yeah," I said softly. "We are." She hesitated. "Do you want me to grab my bag?" I swallowed hard. "I mean, you could. Or you could stay." Mara smiled and reached over, resting her hand over mine on the gear shift. I was hoping you'd say that. We climbed out of the van, standing awkwardly for a moment in the fading light. Her house stood across the street, dark and quiet. My small rented cottage, cozy but plain, was right behind us. Without a word, we grabbed her small travel suitcase and walked to my front door. Inside, everything felt different. The same mismatched furniture, the same tiny kitchen and living room. But now it felt warmer, fuller, like it had been waiting for this moment. Maris set her suitcase down by the couch. I watched her take a deep breath, as if releasing something heavy she'd been carrying. "I think I like it better here," she said simply. That night we ordered pizza, sat on the floor eating slices straight from the box, and watched old movies under a share blanket. There was no big conversation, no heavy declarations. We didn't need them. Everything had already been said in the way we laughed, the way we moved around each other so easily, the way our hands found each other naturally. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Maris in the kitchen, humming as she made coffee. I walked in, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. She handed me a mug. "Good morning, roommate," she teased. I laughed. "Is that what we're calling it?" She smiled playfully. For now, over the next weeks, we fell into a new routine. Some nights we stayed at her place across the street, but most nights she stayed with me. I fixed up my little house, added small touches to make it ours. New curtains, a bigger bed, a rack for her jackets by the door. The Voyager sat parked out front, like a proud reminder of where it all started. We joked about taking it out again just for groceries or a quick weekend escape. One warm Sunday afternoon, we pulled out the big road map we had used during the trip and spread it across the dining table. Maris traced the route with her finger, laughing at all the crazy places we had stopped. I watched her, realizing how completely natural it felt to imagine every future trip with her by my side. "I'm thinking Montana next," she said. I smiled. "Montana sounds perfect." She leaned across the map and kissed me softly. "I never expected this," she whispered. "I never expected us." "Me either," I admitted. "But I wouldn't change a thing." We sat there in comfortable silence, the map between us, the house full of sunlight and the soft ticking of the wall clock. There were no more questions, no more doubts. We weren't just neighbors anymore, or travel companions, or a fling that burned out after the adventure. We were together. For real. For good. The next morning, when I walked out onto the porch with my coffee, I smiled at the sight of Maris's house across the street. The curtains were open, but the windows were dark. She was here, still asleep in my bed. I took a deep breath of the crisp Oregon morning air, knowing that we would probably take the Voyager out again soon. Not to run away from anything, but just because we could. The dream of the road was still alive, but now I had someone to share it with. The best part of all? I hadn't lost my independence. I had gained a partner. As I sipped my coffee and looked at the van, I whispered to myself, smiling, "What are we waiting for?"